Morning, good morning. Want to take just a minute and say a happy Father's Day. Happy Father's Day to you. Dads, this is the day of the year that nothing else changes. You know how it is. See, look, on Mother's Day, if y'all remember, all this section was empty because they all went and sat with Mom. Yeah, now I'm making y'all feel bad. But on Father's Day, no, sorry, Dad. Maybe it's the day that, but maybe there's some good things. Dads, you're the one that gets out in the yard and works with your kid on how to throw and how to catch, how to hit the ball, how to run, roughs you up a little bit, makes you tough. And then you get to go on. Maybe you're one of those lucky few that get that college scholarship and end up playing in the national title game. And then your dad's sitting at home or watching you on the TV on that national game, and that few minutes, maybe a few seconds come across the screen where your son's on the screen, and you think, surely I'm going to get some acknowledgement now. But y'all know what always gets said, right? Hi, Mom. Yeah. So, sorry, dads. But look, kidding aside, dads, I want you to know how important you are. Not too long ago, there was a research done that talked about the importance of having a faithful follower, faithful father who is a faithful follower of Christ. It's so important because the statistics that I read, now you can think of many exceptions to the rule, but the statistics said that only 2% of our young people, if a father never attends church, only 2% of our children remain faithful. That puts Keith and I in a difficult situation trying to work with our teenagers. Dads, don't ever forget how important you are, because you are the foundation of their life, and we only get one shot. So never take for granted that opportunity. So now let's move on. Steve has done a great job talking about faith in action. The operative there, I always liked how on that slide how it has there that I act. Because when we talk about faith, faith is something you and I have to actively, physically do. Read in James chapter 2 with me. If you want to turn over there, James chapter 2, we'll read verses 14 through 17. James 2, 14 through 17 says this: "What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith, but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, be warm and filled,' without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that?" And then the emphasis here, verse 17. "So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, it is dead." I don't believe it's the intention of any one of us here this morning to possess a faith that is dead. I remember back in the 80s, there was a anti-drug commercial. And when the first commercial came on, a lot of you older people remember this. When that commercial first came on, you saw this boy sprinting. And he's talking about, "I want to be a track star when I grow up." But about time he finishes that, you see a police officer laying his hands on him. And the next phrase is, "No one ever says they want to be a junkie when they grow up." You see, the same thing that is trying to teach us is something that we can learn from Scriptures. When we look at it, the commercial is trying to get across the point that choices lead you to where you end up. The same is about our faith. Our choice to act or to do nothing will dictate whether I have an alive or a dead faith. My choice to act or to do nothing will answer that question. We don't have to say, we don't have to, talk about good things. The point is we have to actually do. It is crazy for us to sit here and simply think that our just believing in God is enough to please Him. When we look in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 6, it says, "And without faith it is impossible to please Him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that He exists and that He rewards those who seek Him." You see, again, another action thing. That idea of seeking Him is something that you actually, physically have to do. That's why in grammar we call it a verb. To seek is a verb. You're doing something. Okay? We understand that if my faith is not living, yes, that means actually doing something, that it is dead and worthless. You see, we have to make a choice in life of who we're out to please? Is it God or is it man? Why does that matter? Well, let's turn over to the parable of the talents. Matthew chapter 25. Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 30. When we go through and we read this parable of the talents, you'll see that there's three different people in this parable. There's one who had a lot of talents, had the 10 talents. Then there's one that only had just a few talents, had 2 talents. And then there was one that had simply 1 talent. And when we look at this, the parable that Jesus is trying to get across to us is this. Understand that we must be doing with what we have. Must be doing with what we have. The young man at the center of the whole story is the servant that was given 1 measly little talent. 1 little talent. When the rich man comes back and speaks to each one of these servants about their talents. The first 2, you know, they did well. He was proud and good and faithful servant. Had good things to say. But look at what the one said that only had the 1 talent. We start reading verses 24 and 25. It says this, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid. And I went and hid your talent in the ground. The whole point of our lesson this morning is going to be the fact that the greatest inhibitor of a faith in action is fear that cripples us into doing nothing. What are we so afraid of as Christians? Now, I understand the world that we are living in. If I could sit and talk to some of the older people in the audience and they could tell us how much things have changed simply from their young life up to now, it would be astounding. In my 40 years of life, I've seen a lot of things change. But what are we so afraid of? You know, Keith and I have sat and asked some of the teenagers sometimes, you know, what scares you the most about living out your faith? We've gotten answers like, I just don't want to live this out and find out one day that maybe I was wrong. Then some might say, I don't want to live out my faith and be the kid that's left out of everything. Or maybe, I don't want to live out my faith and be made fun of. You see, these are some of the things that we hear. And just like the young man in the parable of the talents, all these are is excuses. Simply that, they're excuses. I want you to stop and let's go back and let's look in the Bible. You know, Romans 15:4 says, those things that were written before time were written for our learning. You see, we can learn a lot from all these people in the Old Testament and the example that they set. You know, 2 will be from the Old Testament, 1 from the New. Let's think about Daniel. You know, Daniel was a guy that was basically put on trial for his faith. Daniel was a guy that was thrown in a lion's den simply because he wanted to pray to the one true God. Now, the whole thing was a setup and everything, but you want to talk about scary. I don't know how much more scary it can get. I don't know if that was the first time that anyone had ever been thrown in a lion's den, but I kind of don't think it was. Because look at what it says in verse 24. In the latter part of that verse, when it talks about after Daniel had triumphed, and all the men who tried to set him up, when they were held accountable for what they had done, and they were thrown in the lion's den, it says this. It says, before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overtook them and broke all their bones into pieces. I always found that interesting. It said broke all their bones into pieces. You know, there's only really one other time where we read about someone's bones not being broken. We read about Jesus, not a single bone was broken. That was to fulfill a prophecy. So it's interesting to me that the Scriptures actually says that every bone was broken. You don't think that terrified Daniel? You don't think it terrified him to know what his faith was about to get him into? You know, I don't have a way of backing it up, but I think that he probably saw this before, and he knew his fate because that had probably happened before. Let's think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. 3 other friends that were thrown into the fiery furnace. You know, the threat of being burned alive is one that has been throughout history. It has been in history to people face martyrdom by being burned alive. And the thing about being burned alive is, from what I've read, the intense heat actually will start from the inside before it starts on the outside. Because being in that heat and inhaling all the intense heat starts burning your body from the inside out. I was reading in the Christian Courier. Yes, I was reading. Don't be surprised. I was reading in the Christian Courier, and they were talking about there was an excavation that they were doing in Babylon. And they found this large kiln-like room that they thought was to fire pottery and so forth. But they thought, man, this is a pretty big room to be doing that. But then they found an inscription that said, "This is the place of burning where men who blaspheme the gods of Chaldea died by fire." So you take Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they probably saw or heard about someone being thrown in that fire before. They knew what was coming. You don't think they were scared? Think about Peter. Peter stepped out of a boat and walked on the water. Now, I'm going to tell you something about history many people don't know, but I always found it intriguing to me, is that there was a thought and a teaching by the Hebrews and Jews that the Sea of Galilee, in the depths of Galilee, contained evil spirits. That is why when they saw Jesus coming on the water, that's why they immediately thought, oh, it's a ghost. And so Peter knew this teaching. He knew this thought. But yet he stepped over the side of that boat anyway. Maybe he thought, yes, I'm going to walk on this water, but what about all those spirits underneath? It kind of makes me think, my wife just walked out so I can tell this story. It kind of makes me think about when my wife and I first got married and we were here, and around Halloween time, we decided to go to a haunted hayride, haunted maze, and there was a haunted house there also. And there was this one part of the haunted house where just me and my wife, before we had children, we were walking through there, and you had to go through this door, and you had to crawl over this little thing and drop into the next room. Well, I'm leading the way, of course, because I'm pretty fearless and stuff like that. I get up on top of this thing, and right when I get on top of it, they slide this door open, and it's a case full of snakes, like live ones. My reaction was, there's snakes. So I step down on the other side. My wife gets her head to where she can see over this little thing, and she sees this case of snakes. She immediately freaks out. Tears start falling. I reach over, grab her by the back of the shirt, and pull her across. My wife don't like snakes. We look at look at Peter in this passage. Yet he saw a fear. Maybe there was legitimate danger, because we begin to read in the story about all the winds and the waves, how they were beating about. But yet, Daniel got out and did it anyway. If I could teach you one thing this morning, it would be simply this: to understand that danger is real, but fear is a choice. Let me say that one more time. Danger can be real, but fear is a choice. We decide what things we're afraid of, right? We have some people who are afraid of spiders. Some people are afraid of snakes. Some people are afraid of, and I'll never understand this, afraid of clowns. Some of you are going to come to me after me, Scott, they're really scary. Okay. Don't make me feel bad. But when we look at this, go back and think about those three stories. There was legitimate fear in being thrown to a den of hungry lions. There was a legitimate fear about being burned alive. There was a legitimate fear of stepping over the side of that boat and possibly drowning in a tempestuous sea. But none of those fears kept people from living out their faith. None of those fears kept those guys from doing what they knew to do. The case in each of these is that they were afraid was not the point, because I believe they were afraid. I believe they looked in the face of real danger and they were afraid, but they didn't back down. They looked at it and embraced us. None of us in this room this morning, I think, are going to be asked to lay down our life for our faith. And by lay down, I mean physically die for what we believe. Right now, we live in a country that tolerance is so preached that we even get away with it sometimes, of people tolerating us. So I don't think anybody's going to kill us for what we believe. However, just like in the parable of the talents, the one guy with one little talent chose to do nothing. You know, and to kind of semi-quote James 3:10, my brothers, these things ought not be so. I think if every person in this room had a gun to your head and was asked to profess your faith, I believe we would. There's no doubt in my mind I believe we would. But when it comes to living out the little things in our life, we have no time for them. You know, Steve and I sat and kind of talked about these, about what kind of little things are we talking about. And we pretty much agreed on three that I'd throw out here this morning. The first one, how about this? How about simply talking about Jesus to people around you? Romans 1 and verse 16 says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, it is the power of God for salvation for everyone who believed, to the Jew first and also to the Greek." For us to say we're not ashamed of the gospel, yet we don't want to talk about it very much. I want you to think about your Bible class sometime. Even here in a spiritual setting, think about your Bible class sometime. When someone wants to talk about the big game or some major event happening, everybody's got an opinion. But all of a sudden, when I've been in Patrick Swinney's class, when he says, "Somebody want to tell me where they saw God today," nobody wants to talk about it. How about a little thing about talking about your faith? Because when we look in our Bible classes, I can promise you, if you're not willing to talk about spiritual things in a spiritual setting, you're not going to go out and evangelize people. You're not going to go out and talk to people about Jesus. That is something little. Now, let's compare talking to them about faith, being killed for what I believe. There's a huge difference there. All right, how about something else little? How about simply, let me step back. Let's put it this way. Just serving. Simply serving. You know, I appreciate what our elders are doing with wanting to go to 2 services, because we're wanting to be inviting to people. But isn't it bad? I'll just call it. Isn't it a shame that the biggest thing they're worried about right now is whether they're going to have people to fill the roles of service? I don't understand what you're afraid of. Are you afraid that maybe if you're serving the communion, you're going to trip and fall and drop the communion plate everywhere? It wouldn't be the first time. We can clean it up. What are we afraid of when it comes to serving? You know, this is a soapbox that Steve and I have been on for a long time. So I'm going to go ahead and step back up one more time. It amazes me how many moms and dads we can get to coach teams, to show up to prepare for a play, to show up to go on field trips at school, but yet we close doors on Faith Boulevard because we can't find teachers. I don't get it. If we want to teach our children that God is the number one priority in life, then why don't we live it out? Be willing to step up. Are you afraid somebody's going to ask you a question you don't know? Well, I'm going to tell you, after 17 years of being a youth minister, it's going to happen. I'm just telling you. But one thing I've learned is that I gain respect from these young people when I say I don't know and I go find the answer. Are you afraid that one of these kids are going to eat you? I'm going to go on after that one. I don't know. Some of them are a little scary. I mean, what are you afraid of? I referred to dads in the beginning, but I'm talking to parents now. I'm talking about adults. You have the most awesome opportunity to live out your faith by simply volunteering to help in a capacity around here. Again, that's something little. How about something even smaller than that? I wanted to say littler, but that wasn't even the right grammar. How about something even smaller than that? How about simply showing up for worship? In the past 3 years, over 150 people have placed membership at Beltline. Yet we only net about 20. You know, Steve was telling me the other day that in California, people just didn't show up at all. He said, but his biggest fear is here is sometimes we show up, but we don't engage. You see, being at worship is so important, especially for you parents setting an example for your children. Young people, you're not off the hook. Y'all know how encouraging it is to all these adults to see this packed here? because they're encouraged by it. They're encouraged simply by your presence. When we begin to look at Hebrews 10:25, so often it's a call verse for thou shalt go to church. It's not. You're missing the point. The point is being here is such an encouragement to each other that when you're not here, you rob someone of encouragement. Something little that shows faith. The little things that we can do to live out our faith are so important because it gives us a foundation to stand on. Having faith in action cannot be done if we're constantly afraid of what people might say or do. And I know the world we live in has begun to give us reason to be afraid. The persecution that we're beginning to face. You know, some of these persecutions that you might be afraid of, someone might accuse you of being a hypocrite. We don't like to hear that word. But when we try and fail, that's what the world wants to do, just so they can hold us to a different standard. Maybe we're accused of being narrow-minded and living in the past, and maybe you're afraid of that. You know, maybe you're afraid of being accused by someone, or as they used to call it, being a Jesus freak. Maybe you're afraid of that you're going to look silly if you can't quote the book, chapter, and verse. Whatever reason you give to be afraid, I can assure you that whatever fear that you have, it can be overcome by doing one of the following two things. And these two things are simply this. Number one, just do it. Just do it. But before I comment, I'm going to ask Ben Macklin to come up here for just a minute. Ben's one of these guys that can live out this idea of just do it, and I'm going to let him talk about it for just a minute.
Let's do this real quick. Just humor me, if you will. Raise your hand, and raise your hand high, if you have ever wrestled with fear or anxiety at any point in your life. Just don't be afraid. Raise them up. All right, fear and anxiety. Everybody look around. Now, keep them up. Don't be afraid. Hey, keep them up. Look around, everybody. Good news. All right, all this time, I thought it was just me. It's almost unanimous. It's almost unanimous. We all have wrestled with this. We all have at some point struggled with this issue. I'm going to try to just give a quick testimony to the love and the grace and the mercy of Jesus and how that has worked through my life over these last few years. 3 years ago, if you would have told me that I would be standing here today testifying to the love of Jesus, I wouldn't have believed you. No way. I was a comfortable Christian. I was comfortable letting Beltline serve me. I was comfortable letting our preachers and our teachers do my worshiping. And I was comfortable with my relationship with Jesus, which today I can honestly say was non-existent. I can still remember back to when things started to change for me. I remember the conviction in my heart that I needed to do something. I needed to get involved. I felt this pull, but I cowered down to the fear that was in my chest. It just let it get the best of me. And I decided to stay comfortably cemented to my seat, quietly coming in, quietly sneaking back out. Fear, anxiety, worry, doubt, these emotions just kept me quiet. I remember being when I first started getting involved with the cool class. I remember even in a small classroom setting, I didn't want to read scripture, like I can't read or something. I didn't want to participate in a discussion because I was afraid I didn't have the answer. Whenever it was time to ask if anybody wanted to lead prayer for the morning, my head went down because we all know rule number one, if a teacher's calling on somebody in the class, don't make eye contact. Head down. And ironically enough, rule number two, pray. Please don't call on me. Please don't call on me. Please don't call on me. This is the emotion that I was going through. And I was content being afraid. I was okay with it. All of a sudden, that started to change. I got to know some of the guys. We were playing softball together. I was getting comfortable with these relationships. And one of my buddies in the cool class came up to me one afternoon and said, "Hey, man, I need some help. Would you mind teaching a class?" If I'm being honest, the only reason I said yes was because I didn't want to let my friend down. I didn't want to say no and then make him scramble to find somebody else last minute. So I said yes simply to prevent being guilty for saying no. It's such a selfish excuse, but excuses is exactly what I had been living. I had been living a life full of excuses. Well, I'm not smart enough. I don't know enough about my Bible to teach a class. I don't know enough about Jesus to stand up comfortably and preach about him. I'm not a good enough Christian. I have sin in my life. How can I stand up in front of someone else and proclaim the message of the gospel? Who am I to do that? And these are the fears that kept gripped on me that I just couldn't shake off until that one moment of just stepping out. And I'll never forget it. The first class I ever taught was I was doing a class on Paul's letter to Titus. We were doing the renovations on this side, so the cool class was in the fireside room, and we had gone through prayer, getting ready to start. I'm sitting there, I'm ready to go, and the worst possible thing happens. Steve Smith, who was our new preacher at the time, walks into the room and sits down. And I'm thinking to myself, what is he doing? Is he leaving? Is he staying? Oh, he's staying. He's staying. Oh. So all these fears started coming back up. I was overwhelmed by this doubt, this worry. What if my lesson is boring? What if my material is incorrect? What if my theology is bad? What if? I could not have been more wrong. Looking back on it now, I just remember, the class was engaged. We were discussing openly the message that Paul had laid out for us. We were learning together. We were worshiping together. We were laughing together. And in that moment of reflection that I've had this week, I just remember this feeling of God showing me these new talents that I never knew I had. I remember God reaching out and just telling me that there was opportunities for me to serve in this church. There were new ways for me to get involved that I never knew were buried down underneath all this fear and all this anxiety. I had always lived a life that was with a spirit of fear. But God didn't give us a spirit of fear. He gave us a spirit of love. He gave us a spirit of power. He gave us a spirit of self-control. My fear was not in line with God's purposes for my life. And once I stepped out, in that brief moment of just stepping out into something I was so afraid of, everything changed. My goals in life, this newfound meaning in life started to align with what God's purposes were for me. He showed me that there was, I actually had something to offer my Beltline family here. And it wasn't about me anymore, it became about Him. And I don't want to stand up here today and tell you that the things that I've done are because of me, because I'm awesome. It has nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with how awesome God is. Because I will testify to you this morning, if God can stand me in front of you today, a sinner who has spent more of his life turned and running away from God than I'm willing to admit, if He can stand somebody up here today that's had a foul mouth and a wicked heart for far too long, but can redeem me, He can redeem anybody in here. All you have to do is just do it. Just take that leap of faith. Just step out. I assure you, the way that you have pictured it in your mind is so incorrect that you will look back on those moments when you were quietly sitting in your seats and you will laugh and you will rejoice to the glory of God for redeeming you and providing you with these opportunities to get involved with our brothers and with our sisters and to grow together in Christ.
You see, all this did, it started with one simple step, that he just do it. Just step out there, take that step. So when we think about this, there's just a few things that I'll close out with. Nike didn't come up with this just do it attitude. They just commercialized it and tried to make a profit on it. This just do it attitude has been taught from the Scriptures since they were penned. Look in James chapter 1 and verse 22, it says this. It says, "But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourself." I can tell you, if you're afraid to get up in front of people and speak, you're always going to be afraid until you do it. If you're afraid to get up and teach a Bible class, you're always going to be afraid until you do it. If you're afraid to talk to your friend, your relative, or your coworker about Jesus, you're always going to be afraid till you do it. If you're afraid of someone accusing you of being a Christian because you're just afraid, you're always going to be afraid until you do it. If Moses had been afraid of how he sounded, he would have never parted the Red Sea. If Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would have been afraid of the fire and of being burned, they would never know what it was like to walk through fire without being burned. If Peter would have never stepped out of the boat, the total number of people in history to walk on water will stand at one. You see, this just do it attitude has to come from you. And it has to begin with that first step. Number two, if you can't do it alone, take someone with you. The Christian walk and the Christian faith was never one meant to be alone. Think about Jesus when He sent them out. How did He send them out? 2 by 2. They were never alone. If you can't seem to talk to others about Jesus, take someone with you. First off, remember last week Steve mentioned this. He said there cannot be a lo without a go. In Matthew chapter 28 and verse 20, where He says, "And lo, I am with you always, even until the end of the age." That's right after He's encouraged them to go and to teach the world. God is with us. Second, if we go and we take someone with us, if we fail, they're there to pick us up. Turn with me, if you would, and let's read Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 9 through 12. It says, "Two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. For if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. But woe to one who falls when there is not another to lift him up. Furthermore, if two lie down together, they keep warm, but how can one keep warm alone? And if anyone can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken." You see, we shouldn't be trying to do this alone, but we should be acting. We should be doing. Joshua 1 and verse 9 says, "Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous, do not be frightened, and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." It really is as simple as those two things. Just do it. If you can't do it by yourself, take somebody with you. Remember, there's danger is real, but fear is a choice. And what I'm pleading with you today is to live out your Christian life, get past that fear so that people in this world can be changed. If you're afraid to walk this aisle this morning and give your life to Christ, don't let your fear win out. Don't let your fear win out over your love for God. My question for you is, what will you choose today as we stand and as we sing?